As I was checking out the new Poison the Well album, I saw a post about a surprise Neurosis album pop up in my feed. My first thought was, does this mean Scott Kelly's back? That is not the case. However, the lineup change is the real headline story here. Aaron Turner of Isis, Sumac, and Old Man Gloom joined on guitar and vocals. As a big fan of Isis, whose entire existence is tied to Neurosis' influence, this comes as a surprise ideal pairing. An Undying Love for a Burning World is Neurosis' first studio album in 10 years, following Fires Within Fires in 2016. This is an album I honestly thought I would never see after the band parted ways with Scott Kelly in 2019. Now, Neurosis isn't the first band to carry on without a founding member and vocalist, but it is admittedly a massive hurdle to overcome. That becomes even more relevant when you frame it in the context of how important Neurosis has been to heavy music and what has later become defined as post-metal. Their work has been defined as genre-breaking and foundational to later experimental metal acts. So having Aaron Turner step in to fill Scott Kelly's shoe is the band screaming from the rooftops that they're back, and this isn't just some ceremonial replacement. Coming in and contributing immediately, Aaron is more than just a safe hire with a stacked resume. Aaron's career was built on the foundation that Neurosis had built, so it feels almost fitting that he's taken that full circle and is now joining Neurosis for their next chapter. This album was recorded in the winter of 2026 at Studio Litho in Seattle, with Scott Evans handling the recording duties. Then it was mixed in 3 days at Evans' Anti-Sleep Audio in Oakland, roughly 6 weeks before release. Neurosis' own announcement says the sessions happened across 3 weekends, which suggests a focused, compressed production rather than the long, perfectionist studio retreat. Scott Evans is a strong fit on paper and in symbolism. He's known for his work with Sumac, one of Turner's other projects, which places him squarely inside the modern, heavy underground, rather than some legacy rock caretaker. That also makes this record notable because it's the band's first studio album since Through Silver and Blood, not tied to Steve Albini's recording presence, who passed in 2024. The production story sounds lean rather than lavish. What you get is a record made quickly enough to preserve a sense of urgency, which fits the band's statement that making this album felt like a now or never act of catharsis. This all points to a process built around capturing a band that needed to move, not a band trying to engineer some great comeback narrative. This was not announced months in advance with teaser singles and some sort of press build-out. It was surprise dropped. That choice reinforces the idea that this record is being presented as an act of expression first. At the most basic level, this sounds like Neurosis still being Neurosis, but with tweaks to internal chemistry, altering it just enough to matter. Their Bandcamp tags the album with metal, doom, industrial, post-metal, progressive metal, and sludge. Early reviews describe it as carefully constructed, cerebral, intrinsically heavy, with a mix of punishing riffs, ambient drift, electronics, and psychedelic afterglow. This is not metal built around speed or technical flash. This is metal built around weight, dread, patience, ritual, and release. The songs often feel less like verse-chorus structures and more like landscapes changing shape. What seems different on this record is the way that Turner shifts the vocal and emotional center of gravity. Older Neurosis often had Scott Kelly and Stephen Von Till functioning like two halves of one ominous voice. Well, this album sets up Turner and Von Till more as contrasting figures, with Turner bringing a ferocious modern abrasion. This record is not a reboot or a sound drifting into Isis 2.0, but a version of Neurosis that suddenly sounds conscious of its descendants and leans into that just enough. Unlike the new Poison the Well album that had no standout tracks, because it felt more like they were trying to cram their original storyline into a sequel like The Force Awakens. This was hard to pick out some standout tracks because they were all outstanding. Mirror Deep is one of the early focal points because it arrives right after the 52-second opening piece, and it effectively announces the album's roadmap. Early commentary describes the track as lurching and clawing into being, mixing sludge heft with textural atmosphere. It sounds like one of the places where the new lineup really proves itself, not by copying old formulas, but by making the band feel alive again from the first notes. First Red Rays is one of the key transition songs on the record. Reviews highlight its celestial ambience and the way it builds into a more expansive finale. while other reviewers are pointing to its movement between crushing weight with an almost zen-like drift. This is a perfect example of Neurosis still understanding long-form dynamic payoff better than most bands who have followed them into this style. Coming in at just over 9 minutes, Blind is probably my favorite track on the album so far. The layering of Turner's howl over Von Till's cleaner vocals brings a new kind of vocal tension.
Adrift on sightless plains, arid ground tearing souls.
Structurally, it leans into contrast rather than immediate payoff. It leans into a more atmospheric break that continues to build and layer into a final crescendo. Untethered is the album's shortest track, and it's notable because one of the album's bluntest lyrical lines appear here. The hive has lost its fucking mind. It looks like one of the album's most direct confrontations with social fragmentation. This is probably the easiest place to connect the record's personal rebirth arc to a wider social collapse. Last Light comes in just under 17 minutes. This is an obvious epic centerpiece, and likely the song most fans will end up arguing about. Some reviews point to its dissonant major chord progressions and pulsing scales, while early listener reactions keep circling back to it as a track that encapsulates the album. If you need one song to discuss as a thesis statement, this is probably it. Slow unfolding, enormous architecture, no cheap catharsis, and a sense of beauty that just never resolves. The official statement around this album is unusually revealing. Neurosis explicitly frames a record around personal trial, collective insanity, isolation, anxiety, climate crisis, and mass extinction. That gives you one broad thematic field immediately. This is not a concept album in the traditional narrative sense, but it is clearly built around life under pressure, social fracture, and the search for catharsis without false hope. A few lines and fragments already stand out in coverage, like "The hive has lost its fucking mind," as I mentioned earlier from Untethered. And the closing song includes images like being cast from the sun into shade, and time hanging heavy on the skin, which points towards a late album mood of attrition rather than redemption. This album is about how to continue living, creating, and feeling after corruption, collapse, and disillusionment without pretending those things have been solved. Because this album is only a few days old, the reception picture is early but strong. Coverage from Pitchfork, The Quietus, Louder, Stereogum, Brooklyn Vegan, and others treated the surprise release as a major event in heavy music, largely because of the band's history and because Turner's arrival changes the stakes from simple continuation to a real reinvention. The most substantive critical take visible so far is A Quietus' review, which is clearly positive. It describes the album as carefully constructed, cerebral, and intrinsically heavy, and frames it as a compelling return that deals honestly with the band's broken history. Sputnik's early review is even more enthusiastic, calling it a comeback for the ages, and praising the combination of sludge riffs, serene build-up, doom pacing, and industrial texture. In terms of controversy, the album is unavoidably shadowed by Scott Kelly's abuse and removal, but the early conversation is not treating the release as evasive. It is being received as a difficult but serious continuation by the remaining band, while Turner's presence functions as both an artistic renewal while also ethically distancing them from the old lineup reality. What can be said now is that Neurosis already had an enormous influence on heavy music, and this album is being discussed as a meaningful new chapter rather than an afterthought. The band's 90s and 2000s records helped to define post-metal. And writers still describe newer bands as working inside templates that Neurosis established. Turner joining the group intensifies that history because he comes from ISIS, one of the most visible bands shaped by Neurosis' example. And the question is, does this become a rare, late-period album that meaningfully reopens the band's story after many listeners assumed the story was either finished or permanently poisoned? Early reactions suggest that possibility is very real, but it's still too early to really tell. This album matters because it's not merely the band's first album in a decade. It's their first real statement after the collapse of one era and the arrival of another. It introduces Aaron Turner into a group whose own sound helped shape his career, and it does so without pretending the past can be cleaned up or forgotten. Musically, it sounds like late-period Neurosis rediscovering their momentum, with huge long-form songs, ambient dread, industrial texture, and a renewed sense of tension. Historically, This is a rare comeback album that actually changes the meaning of the band's story instead of just extending it. So I am genuinely curious, what did you think of Neurosis with Aaron Turner at the helm?